Welcome to the High Potential Startup Series. I'm joined this week by Jack O'Meara, co-founder and CEO of Ocrobio, a genomics-based drug discovery company developing siRNA therapies to rejuvenate transplanted livers. With Jack, I talked through a number of pieces through what the business is doing as well as what it's got up ahead in terms of opportunity and his journey, which I think is fair to say is unique. Proud to have this podcast sponsored by Octopus Ventures, one of Europe's largest and most active VCs with over £1 billion under management and a portfolio of more than 100 companies. Their investments specialise in 5 areas: health, fintech, deep tech, consumer and business-to-business software. The health team is looking to back entrepreneurs who are transforming the health industry from digital therapeutics through to biotech at seed, Series A and Series B. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Look forward to your feedback. Hey Jack, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, thank you for having me. What an unusual, different version than our normal calls.
My pleasure. I think it's we must be small scale in comparison to the stuff I've seen you do recently. I think last time we bumped into each other in person, that was off the back of you doing a 10,000 person presentation to the tech world. Now it's just lonely old me and you in our offices. But thanks for coming.
Oh, I appreciate lonely old me and you, Nick. Much more personal than a scary large audience.
I think before we'd spoken to you, I hadn't heard anything about you. And then we spoke, and ever since I've been connected to a whole host of people that speak very highly. And it seems like your influence has been really broad. And I think in the Oxford ecosystem in particular, I think there are many people that will talk about actually the impact you're having on the ecosystem as a whole. Is there any overall thought and plan to outside of Ocrobio and the things that you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, interesting question. I guess in some ways I am very passionate about the UK biotech ecosystem. Well, I guess maybe I'm passionate about democratizing entrepreneurship. And I spent a long time in the US and I got really kind of addicted to the ambition and the pace and the scale of everything over there. And having grown up in Ireland, I always felt there's sort of a parochialness to entrepreneurship and startups in this part of the world. Maybe that's a little bit harsh, but so I guess I do a lot on the ecosystem development side, and I do a lot on the bridge building between the UK, US, and Asia to try and bring some of that entrepreneurial energy and spirit from the Californias or the Bostons of the world to the UK. And as part of that, yeah, I'm very active in working with early stage founders, kind of giving my perspective on their journeys and trying to share learning. I think that's you mentioned the tech audience as well. I try to stay away from tech as a biotech entrepreneur, but I do think there's tremendous learnings that the biotech sector can take from tech on the people, communications, sort of operations side of company building, and even just generally spreading the word across the public. Like biotech can be a little bit of an insular sector where the broader public doesn't really understand and increasingly trust the work that we do. So trying to spread the word, communicate about our stories. I think tech does that very well. So anyway, I guess I'm trying to help cultivate a similar type of community than what we see in the tech startup world.
Okay, great. And then what brought you back to the UK then? So what was the driver to pull you back to this side of the world?
Yeah, I lived there in the US for 6 years and I was starting to get a bit of an American accent. So that was making me nervous and first and foremost. So I was thinking I need to do a runner. But I mean, family, I didn't ever want to stay in the US long term. I always saw it as like a really great learning and development opportunity and kind of get exposure to a lot of the more ambitious innovative companies, which I was fortunate enough to be able to do with the likes of Avexis and others over in the US. And then I always wanted to come back. So I actually stayed longer than I thought I was going to stay. When I moved over there first, a wise old Irishman told me there's a 3 or 30-year rule in the US for immigrants. You either stay for 3 or if you stay beyond that, you're here for 30. And then you'll eventually end up back across the pond. Anyway, I somehow defied that rule and stayed for 6 and then left. But I got a lot out of those 6 years and yeah, really excited to be at what I see as sort of a nascent phase of UK biotech entrepreneurship and a really exciting time. There's incredible, I mean, people will hear me, you might have heard me talk to death about this, but there's amazing scientific innovation happening in the UK and Europe. But there really isn't that much of a commercial angle or commerciality to the entrepreneurial ecosystem over here. And that's fundamental to building a big company. But the tech world in the last 5 to 10 years in Europe has exploded. All of a sudden, you've got lots of really large companies like Monzo and Revolut and Klarna, and a lot of those are in fintech. I think we're starting to see that same trend of ambitious entrepreneurs building big companies in Europe, and it's sort of just at the inflection point in biotech, I think. So anyway, I'm pretty excited to be here at this point and hope to help cultivate the ecosystem.
Yes. And I really agree with your sentiment that I've been in the industry for 7-8 years now, and it has taken a shift. It really has changed. And I think that sits throughout, seeing the likes of an Adaptimmune and Immunocore that have come through and sort of sit at the larger end of the scale. But the ambitions that are now coming from the next generation of startups is even grander. And it's really starting to come through in people like yourself and others that are in the industry, UK, Europe, and Ireland. I think across the board, people they're not limiting themselves as they used to. And that also ties back to, I think, investors being slightly more aggressive and ambitious, and US investors taking a better look at what's going on in Europe and realizing that there are diamonds in the rough. And it's just that, it goes back to your point, I'm turning a concept into a product. The gap's getting smaller. The two tough parts now, I haven't used this term and I haven't heard it called this for a while, but the valley of death, that pre-seed, seed, up to a Series A point where it is really tough, I think it's I'm not going to go as far as to say easy, but it's got easier. And I think there are great ambitions from the established investors in the sector in Europe to also bridge the gap when it comes to growth funds and take companies from being 50 people to 200 people and keep it in Europe and keep it in the UK.
I'd like to think so. I think there's a few things that help to drive really big, I guess the whole, everyone wants to build another next Silicon Valley, or really density of entrepreneurial activity. And one of it is just seeing it done before really changes the scale of ambition for everyone who comes afterwards. The entrepreneurship is it's like an infectious disease in ways. Once you get the bug, it can really catalyze large innovation. So seeing companies like Adaptimmune, like Immunocore, like Kymab, who was acquired not too long ago, Exscientia, GW, there's more and more that we can now point to as real success stories coming from this side of the world that weren't really there 5-10 years ago in as consistent a way. And having all those people who are part of those journeys maybe want to go start their own thing or just be recycled back into the ecosystem. Like, you are obviously people-centric, so you know this better than most. That just up-levels the overall, the companies that come afterwards. All of a sudden, they're not breaking barriers for the first time. They have the people in the wings who've seen it before and can really drive innovation forward. And then the next thing is capital, right? And I think traditionally, US capital was a bit more US centric, and that's changing. Capital is becoming a lot more global, and people can now do board meetings and everything over Zoom. So there's less of this parochialness to venture capital as well. It's looking around the world to try and find those diamonds in the rough. And a lot of the science, which fundamentally drives the science industry, it emanates from the UK and has done traditionally. So now if you marry that entrepreneurial commercial talent with a global access to capital, I think it really positions the UK quite nicely. And then a lot of the investors here are having to compete with US terms. That drives their game, and they can't sit on the laurels as much as maybe had been done before. So anyway, I just think it's a really exciting time. And yeah, echo a lot of your sentiments.
Going back to the shift then from being in the US to coming back to the UK and starting the business and taking what I imagine was a massive leap at the time. What caught your eye, and how long was it before you went, right, okay, I'm going to take the big leap and I'm going to take the step from being in a consulting firm, a relatively steady organization, probably good career opportunities, to throwing it all at it and going, yeah, let's start a business?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess I've always had an entrepreneurial tendency. And I read this book, Super Founders, recently, and it said the strongest correlatory with large entrepreneurial success was like whether you were entrepreneurial as a child. And I think it is somewhat, it was always in my blood. So I was always keen to start a business. And I even went to the US with the intent of staying in sort of entrepreneurial companies. But anyway, so I knew I wanted to come back to the UK and give it a rattle. And I was also like relatively young, and I worked with a number of executives in large biotechs. And you're really working long hours, traveling a lot. So I was pre-family, I felt I could just throw everything at it. So I felt like it was a good time to try and start a company, even though maybe by traditional biotech standards, was a little bit on the younger side of the coin to start a company. But anyway, I that was the intent. So I came back to the UK. I did this program called Entrepreneur First, where you effectively try and bring together people with industry expertise and then people with very strong technical expertise and try and marry them together around new business ideas. And that's where I met my co-founder and CSO, Quinn, who's just a phenomenally visionary scientific founder with a very unusual view, very novel take on how to improve outcomes in liver disease. That was just, I thought, fascinating and incredibly scientifically elegant, and was a really and a once in a lifetime opportunity to drive forward a new approach for a big unmet medical need. So as soon as I met him and heard the story, it really didn't take long. I mean, I think I was probably in the UK all of about 4 days at that point, and we'd already sort of gotten started pretty quickly. So I was very fortunate in a lot of ways. I had done my research before moving back and kind of looked up a number of different people who I thought could be good to work with, and it just became very apparent very early on that this was a really amazing opportunity and a very elegant idea behind starting a company. So
the entrepreneurship as a child, it'd be good to hear a little bit more about that, but also how does that then tie to the life sciences? And
I guess when this is probably a bit banal, but when I was thinking about what to study in university, I had a very strong proficiency for maths and for biology. So that put me in this sort of biomedical engineering area, and I did some work in tissue engineering, and then went on to study commercializing science as a domain in university and grad school, and then always stayed within the healthcare ecosystem. I did a stint in global development for a while, and I thought I was going to go down a path of potentially of healthcare in developing countries, but ultimately came back to innovation, which is a big passion of mine. I guess it's three things that sort of were a framework for how I thought about my career. Were one, what's going to leave the world a better place than I found it? So what's the big impactful area to go and focus on? Two, what's going to be really challenging and inspire or push you to really achieve great things? And then lastly was what's going to be kind of fun along the way. So using that framework, I went through a few different iterations of it, but ultimately ended up in life sciences innovation as like an incredibly, profoundly impactful sector to work in. It really is amazingly leveraged in terms of what one person could potentially contribute to human experience is amazing. And then also it's just so complex and nuanced and requires so much strategy and deep thinking. And then it's just a lot of fun to work with high-end scientific talent and really, to work in an industry as fascinating as biology. Biology is it's like the deep ocean. We still don't really understand. There's this sort of abyss element to it that we don't fully understand yet. And that playing in that space really requires a certain element of creativity, a certain element of mathematical and strategic thinking.
Sort of ties quite well to AquaBio in terms of that biology and mathematics mix, that it isn't a one-dimensional biotech in terms of how it operates. And when you founded the company, what was the problem, the real-world problem you'd sort of identified and targeted? What was the target for the business?
Yeah, so when Quinn and I first got together, we spent a lot of time thinking about. He'd built his career in liver discovery, or trying to understand the fundamental biology and potential new therapeutic ways to treat liver disease, which is a very complex chronic condition, typically affected by a multitude of things from genetics through to lifestyle factors and so forth. So when we started talking, we were thinking about why has there been no success? There's nothing approved for chronic liver disease patients. And why is that? And the three large problems that we identified that are oftentimes common across chronic diseases of aging, like neurodegeneration and others, are the first one is we still don't really understand the biology. We need to really dig in to better understand what potential targets are really going to be appropriate for treating this complex indication. Number two, the preclinical models, so the way we test out new discoveries, new drugs, don't work. We've cured liver disease in thousands, if not millions of mice, and that never works in a human. So the definition of insanity is continuing to do something that doesn't work. Number three, clinical trials for chronic diseases like liver disease are really expensive. Because it's a silent disease without very good biomarkers, patients don't actually know they have it until very late stage in the disease process. And that means you have to develop drugs for the very end of the disease. And it means just clinical trials are going to have very high patient numbers to see statistical significance. And that is just a really difficult economic challenge to solve. So the way we got together to address each of those individuals, so Quinn and I, when we first started talking, we're like, how do we systematically go through each of those challenges and try and unlock value across the whole value chain to ultimately enable us to bring medicines into the clinic and beyond? So rather than solving one part of it, we wanted to really tackle the whole thing. And that for me was a really ambitious place to start. So for the first problem of the biology, we use a lot of, I think what we're going to spend some time on today, technologies, what we call deep phenotyping. So where we single cell and spatial sequence thousands of liver tissue samples, human liver tissue samples, amass this massive genomic data set, and then really mine that data, let computationalists loose to really study what are the different potential gene targets or potential drug targets that could be therapeutically relevant to reversing or treating that disease, and really coming up with new fundamental hypotheses around the biology. So that's step one, that we think we've got a really differentiated and competitive approach to. The second step is mouse models don't tell us much, so let's just forget about them to the extent possible before necessary for regulatory conversations. Let's focus on human tissue-derived models. So that means everything from cellular models in vitro through to precision slices of fresh biopsies of diseased liver tissue through our Taipei lab, through to actually taking whole human livers that have been rejected for transplant. These are organs that would otherwise be gone in the bin, keeping them alive on these new transplant machines for almost a week, and then delivering drugs to an actual human liver outside the body and studying how that drug impacts and potentially improves the health of that liver. And that approach, we think, is way more translational to human liver disease than a mouse that has 12 lobes in its liver and can eat half its body weight in paracetamol and just is a fundamentally different creature to a human. So that we thought was in solving the second problem of translational models. And then the last thing is, rather than going into a multi-year NASH study that's going to cost you tens of not hundreds of millions of dollars and going to be incredibly difficult to raise finances on, particularly for new biology that inherently makes investors nervous, even though it's, again, definition of insanity is trying the same targets, the same models that we know don't work. Irrespective, we wanted to find niche indications where we can first prove out this innovation in a controlled or in a small, cost-effective clinical study, demonstrate that our medicines work, and then move into the more complex, much more expensive, much more important in some ways, indications like chronic liver disease and cardiometabolic disease and so forth. So that initial focus has been on liver transplantation, where there hasn't been a lot of innovation. Investors don't see it as a big market. It's not necessarily a big market, so about 10,000 transplants done per year in the US. But it's a really great place to demonstrate that the drugs we're making will actually have an impact on liver disease patients. And it's ultimately then a great way to prove out our approach before moving into more complex conditions and bring innovation to a transplant medical condition that doesn't get innovation because investors, as I said, don't see it as a hugely economically attractive opportunity. But we can do some really good in that space before then moving into a much more bigger indication that gets the investors excited.
So I sat down recently with the head of a fund who talked, and one of the pieces that they looked at from an investment landscape was their ESG profile, and it was animal testing sitting in there. I think now that it's been, largely in Europe at least, illegal to test on animals for cosmetic purposes, it has sort of fallen down the list of priorities, I think, in terms of where the reality of these large-scale animal testing that goes on, which lots of for necessity and essential, but large amounts are also, to your point, rather pointless and wasted time, effort, energy, and suffering. The FDA seems to be taking a more proactive approach than Europe in terms of the regulation landscape. Any thoughts on how quickly the industry will see change to animal models? Because you're not the only CEO I speak to, and I think also this occurs in oncology and other therapeutic fields, where the faith in animal models is low in translating that through to success in humans.
Yeah, look, I think there's a few things to be aware of, or a few factors that drive where we've gotten to with drug testing and maybe where we'll end up over the next few years. First thing is regulators are responsible for public safety. So it is in the regulator's best interest to absolutely not innovate. It's in a regulator's best interest to make sure whatever is done followed typical procedures. So should a horrible event happen where things went wrong, they're not going to be the ones who let the company off the hook from the 17 animal model, from the extensive animal testing that was necessary. So that sense of discomfort is part of the reason why at times, I'm not saying, and I need to come back to the animal model just to clarify some things as well in a minute, but at times there is definitely a feeling that the regulator pushes companies towards over-the-top animal testing regimes that ultimately may not give you data that is going to ultimately be useful for determining whether a drug is safe and effective. Again, these are case-by-case examples, and we're not going to go into too much detail here, but there is just that backdrop to be aware of. So change takes time, and getting regulators and investors and the market comfortable with new alternatives is going to take time, but it's an important conversation to have, and it's one that a number of companies, including ourselves, are going to increasingly be focused on over the next few years. Second thing on animal models, just to clarify my point, I'm not saying we need to move away entirely. I know that from animal testing, or we're in a place where we can, because animal studies will have a role, at least at this point, to play for systemic tox studies. So we test efficacy in a human liver, but we don't know to the extent there are any systemic concerns with a drug product that's delivered intravenously for a human. So we still do animal testing for a much more reduced animal testing regime, saving a lot of our furry friends. But it is still important to make sure that the drugs that we're going to dose intravenously to patients don't have any side effect that we're not aware of in an organ isolated on a machine. So that's just an important point of clarification. Anyway, the more optimistic one, to the future, what does the future hold? I think it's a really exciting time. There's a whole host of new innovations and even papers coming out now to demonstrate that certain models, whether it's organ on a chip models, whether it's our human organ models, have a higher predictive value than animals. Like they're outperforming scientifically animals to tell us what drugs are going to work in patients. Again, as I said, doesn't necessarily mean they're the best safety models at this point, but with things like computational modeling becoming way more sophisticated, there's a host of new approaches to really get ourselves as scientists and regulators and patients comfortable that we've done absolutely everything we can to ensure the safety and efficacy of these medicines. And maybe at some point, way down the road, I don't think we're there yet, we'll be able to really move away from animal studies, because not only is it really just horrific for all those involved, and I mean it's also very toxic for people who are running these studies. It's a really tough job. It's also not very good. It's not a very good model of disease. We have a 95% failure rate across the drug industry, and all of those drugs worked in animal models before they were put into human testing. So anyway, I do think there will be increased innovation in this particular domain of drug discovery, but change comes dropping slow, in the words of slightly tweaked version of book.
I think you made the point there that it is a journey, and often the first steps are the hardest, right? And I think it feels like we've made the first steps, as an industry, and engaging with this and starting to move forward, which is good. And that. Yeah.
Everything takes 20 years of biotech, right? I think we're probably in the fifth year in. The Oka is on its fourth, so everything takes 20.
Question for you. Did you identify the gaps first or have the solutions?
We identified the gaps first. I think that's when it's underappreciated and different about our story is oftentimes biotechs or innovation in general falls out of some new idea, new concept. Oh my God, we can, print DNA faster than anyone else can. And then they kind of try and find a certain application for it. We took the opposite approach where we said, what is wrong? Why have we no treatments for liver disease, even though it affects 1 in 4 people? It is it is the third leading cause of premature death in the Western world, in the industrialized world. There's nothing for patients. And then how do we address each of the challenges holding the field back in a systematic way to really improve the probability of success?
So the business, no doubt, over those 4 years has changed quite dramatically. I imagine you've done things like kickoffs and so on. Biggest difference from year one to where you are today in terms of organization?
Oh, it's hard. It's like unrecognizable. I biggest difference. I think we're at a point now in our development where we're building out sort of senior leadership teams and translational expertise and sort of setting the stage to really move the company into the clinic and beyond. And I think that's a really exciting space for me, at least. Because I come from more of the corporate side of the house. I'm originally a semi-scientist. I don't know. I'm a biomedical engineer. I know that's kind of sits on the peripheries of science. But I have been, in the weeds of the R&D and supporting all of the process, supporting that whole infrastructure for the last 3 years. And now we're like, okay, now we've done all the infrastructure, and now they're going to start making some big bets on drug products to take into the clinic. And which do we partner? Which do we develop ourselves? How do we think about maturing the org structure? All that sort of stuff is where I get really excited. And I'm like, this year, I'm more excited this year than any other year. And I keep saying that, but this one in particular, I mean it. So yeah, and I think that'll bring in more corporate leadership will help us just ensure the financial stability and ensure the company is set up to really bring multiple products through the clinic and beyond, which is the long-term vision for the company.
Yeah. And this maybe goes back to something we touched on earlier about building real entities of real size and scale and breadth of impact. Where do you see the business in 5 years' time? Where would you like to be? What are the big milestones and goals for the organization?
Yeah, that is a really fun question to think about. I mean, 5 years, I was almost going to say a commercial product, but in transplant, that's not unreasonable. And we're soon to be nominating a lead for clinical testing and ideally get into the clinic in 2024. And the transplant development process is relatively expedited given the nature of the indication. Maybe, or if not, at least close to commercializing or building a go-to-market capability for lead program and a pipeline. We're very much about pipeline related to liver and cardiometabolic disease. So a number of other assets adjacent to our lead program in the clinic, preparing for launch, probably a couple of large partnerships to really validate this thesis of genomics and human tissue derived models, improving the probability of success in this complex indication. And a much larger company. We very much see ourselves as a global company. We've already set up bases in sort of key geographies in the US and Asia, and we'll continue to build out on them. And yeah, really the stage is set for a large new biopharmaceutical developer.
Okay. So going back to the pieces that give you the key to unlocking these issues and getting past a lot of these problems. So the deep phenotyping work that you're doing, where you're analyzing, well, I imagine in terms of the human testing, the testing that you're doing on live livers.
Yeah.
Testing on those livers, how are you using that data to develop the RNA drug candidates that you're producing?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And maybe I like to break it up into those three things. There's like discovery, translation, and then clinical. Deep phenotyping sits across the first two of those aspects, but just to give you an initial view of what it means, particularly on the discovery side, it really means we're studying at a tissue level what's driving disease processes. And maybe it's useful to contrast it to how other companies do discovery in our space. Depending on how well in the know you are about target discovery, a lot of big biotechs are very excited about this idea of genetically validated targets, right? GWAS, large number of patient genome studies to see variants that seem to be correlated with a particular disease, and therefore they might be great drug targets to take into the clinic. That's great for rare diseases. And I used to work in an orphan indication with Avexis, and the target was very well defined, where there's one genetic mutation. If you fix that mutation, you're going to solve the disease. It's a really abnormal disease. That is less good in chronic disease, where it's not necessarily a single mutation that's driving the disease process. There's a host of lifestyle and environmental factors that are contributing to that disease. And so we don't think GWAS is a great place to think about targets. And that's where a lot of the targets that are currently in development have originated from, PNPLA3 and HSD and so forth. We think a better approach is trying to get functional evidence behind a target's role in the disease process. So what we mean by that is we take diseased tissue samples across the spectrum and the continuum of liver disease, which takes 15 years. It takes a long time to develop this chronic indication. And then we look using spatial sequencing and single cell sequencing technologies where we see stages of the disease process and look at what genes are upregulated as the liver tissue is beginning to get inflamed, let's say, or even beginning to get quite fibrotic. What genes seem to be driving that process and therefore could potentially be great targets to reverse that process. And we do this across thousands of liver tissues using imaging AI to study the phenotypes, so study what's the stage of disease or the disease niche, and then what are the transcriptomic changes using sequencing data at those particular stages to infer new target hypotheses. So that, I think, gives you at least an overview of what we mean by deep phenotyping. We also do it in a more elegant way where we knock out certain genes in precision slices of liver tissue and see how the biology changes to try and infer causality or bring what's really causal evidence behind a gene's role in the disease process. Anyway, this is quite technical stuff. I don't know how technical the audience will be, but the way to analogize it maybe is that if GWAS gives you a compass to sort of directionally tell you what could be a potential way to treat the disease, we're basically building the Google Maps of disease progression, and really in a much more elegant and sophisticated way, trying to map out what is the disease trajectory across all these different pathways, and ultimately give ourselves the best chance of getting back the way in as short a time possible. I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of how we do target discovery. And then when we think about our models, like the human organ model itself, it just gives us this amazing ability to iterate through drug candidates. So RNA, people have probably heard Stéphane Bancel and Moderna talk about this programmability. Once you know the sequence, once you know what's driving the disease, you effectively program and print the medicine. This goes back to the central dogma of biology, which I probably don't need to educate the audience on, but once you know the gene, you can develop the RNA medicine to knock down the gene, in our case, using siRNA, in weeks, in days, even if you were really on hyperdrive. So that ability to go, okay, we have a hypothesis. We think this target is driving the disease. We've seen it in our data sets. There seems to be some signal here. Let's test it. Then we can go straight to a human liver, test out that drug candidate in an actual human liver and go, didn't work. Or, oh, it did work. Beautiful. Let's try and understand that more and go deeper into the mechanism of action. And we can do this all in a matter of weeks. And that ability to iterate is central to the thesis. Because you think about drug discovery traditionally, in some academic lab, we see an association between a particular gene and disease. We think that's a really exciting target. 3 years later, we develop a drug candidate. You go through a bunch of animal testing that doesn't tell you anything. And then you go into, am I joking? I shouldn't be so crude. But then you go into human testing, and it's been 7 years since that academic published that paper. And you've got a 7-year cycle to prove or disprove that, that thesis. So anyway, we've squeezed that down to a few weeks, and we can then very quickly iterate through new hypotheses, new drug candidates to make sure we're arriving at what is the fundamental mechanism that's going to really enable us to better treat this disease. And I think that is sort of the secret sauce in ways.
Right. It is incredible how, and I think there's still this monumental shift to come, but how technology and a new set of tools is going to radically change the way we work in the industry as a whole. I think it's going to be a long time till it really affects, I think, later stage development pieces, and that's more of a confidence play. But we saw it during COVID, the ability to move from I've got an idea through to having a product and it's commercialized. But that large scale gap between I've got an idea, let's test it in a human, and the delay, essentially, there's a 5-year lag. To your point, that 5-year lag between concept through to products and dose. And if you had that in the tech world with an app or another piece of technology, you just wouldn't accept it. It just doesn't translate through. It work. Like you're ancient by that point. You may as well get
Can you imagine an app developed 5 years ago trying to commercialize now? Like, that's a great analogy. It's like it's the science has moved on so much like that. It's like who is this guy? You're kind of looking at what is it?
Well, that's exactly right. Yeah. So and I think that my feel is that the acceleration of our industry and the radical shift in it will be through technology that enables talent to move around more freely in terms of actually focusing on perhaps more manual tasks and focusing the brains on things that will radically shift and move the needle. We think about the CGT manufacturing space, which is incredibly complex and requires incredibly talented people. But if you can take it over with a robotic process or a manufacturing process that doesn't require hands-on skill sets, you're going to free up a large amount of talent to then fill the gaps that are currently sat on an R&D perspective, that are sat in the discovery phase, or through to actually just accelerating and shortening timelines to reaching results and decisions. I think there's going to be an incredible shift, and this maybe goes back again to regulators then trying to keep up with how the industry is going to move with far more momentum than it ever has. But it does feel like it's at a tipping point. And maybe I felt like we've been there for a while, at least in the tipping point. And I should remember that, we're talking about medicine as being designed for the last 300-400 years. The industry is still relatively new to some degree when you look over human lifespan. But I think that radical shift seems like it's coming down the track, and Ocrobio is a really good example of that starting to have impact. Do you see AI having broad-scale impact across the industry? And perhaps I didn't wax as lyrically as I wanted to, but do you think it's going to have the dramatic shift in the way we operate industry-wise that I think it will?
Yeah, as I maybe said earlier, I think all of these hype cycles take way longer to actually see effect than people think. So the hype cycle that AI went through, I don't know, 5 years ago, or maybe less than, is probably actually 20 years out. I mean, before we have evidence that it's going to work. I think AI is, and just computational tools in general, ML and so forth, they just give you another way to view the world, another tool for your toolkit that ultimately will drive additional productivity in drug development. And we're starting from a pretty low base point. Yeah. So all of these tools really help us get closer to medicines that work faster. And I think the thing that's maybe more AI has more of a difficulty in demonstrating its value as opposed to like a gene therapy or so forth, in that once you see an AAV gene therapy like what Avexis did work, all of a sudden people go, wow, this actually works. I don't think AI is going to have a moment like that. I don't think one drug working that has been AI designed is really going to shift everything. But I think over the next decade or two, it is going to be fundamental to productivity of pharmaceutical companies, and both biotech and large pharmaceutical companies, because it just allows you to move faster, allows you to take some of that time off your scientists' work to just make that, allow them to spend more time thinking and less time on the manual stuff. I mean, you think about it, ChatGPT is such a fun example of it. I don't know if you've used it. I used it to write my press release for our new chairperson last week, and I was like, I would have spent 2 hours on this, but it just wrote it for me. And now I spent 20 minutes editing it and making it sound like, appropriate for what we want to say. And it's kind of the same thing. I mean, if you bioinformaticians maybe you can envision a world where all of the rudimentary code that needs to be written to analyze data sets, ChatGPT or AI does it, and then they do more of the finessing and the tweaking and sort of that critical questioning of what comes out of the other side. So I think it's here to stay. I think the idea that it's going to print medicine and kind of tell us all the answers is probably a bit far-fetched, but it will increase the productivity of the teams that adapt it, and the teams that actually integrate it with their company builds. I think that's going to be also the long-term differentiator, because you see pharma increasingly now setting up AI divisions. I just went for a run with one of the senior folks at GSK's AI division, and she was complaining that it sat on the outside and kind of was looking in and trying to, but it never really fully, I'm misspeaking now, but basically you want to build it, if you're in a position to build it throughout your whole organization as your organization scales, that's really exciting, because then you can really fully maximize the utility of the technology in a way that it's more difficult to do if you're just trying to fit it into an existing infrastructure.
Yeah. Which comes to maybe the really hard balance between that marriage between technology and biology, and the different talent types that sit within that group, and actually getting people that see it both ways. Because I think if you fall too far one side or the other, you fail to maximize the potential. If there was any debate internally and whether you've ever felt that you sort of treading the line between a tech-based company or a biology-based company. I realize yours is far more elaborate than that, but on a simple scale, I think that's one of the challenges the industry has as a whole.
Yeah, I think it spreads even to how investors view you, which is also important as you think about building the company. We've always seen ourselves as a biology company, and we'll leverage, but it goes back to this founding premise that we were trying to systematically address a big problem and applying appropriate technologies where we saw they would add value to helping us address this big problem of chronic liver disease. So in our context, AI is useful largely from a target discovery perspective as we mine our genomic data sets to come up with new target hypotheses, and from a rapid ability to iterate and learn from some of the studies that we run and match it to our sort of in silico liver. But that's the use case. It's not going to help us really from a drug design perspective. We're just using traditional oligo design techniques there because we think they're the most efficient way to do that. We tried out different computational techniques and they didn't really augment our ability to do so. So we moved on. And I think that ability to find the right use case for these technologies is key. But then as you message externally, making sure you're setting expectations appropriately so people don't think, you are fundamentally a technology company working in biotech, because I think everyone working in biotech is a biotech company. and they maybe have a stronger technology bent in different capacities, but I think there's no avoiding the market context and the way the industry runs. If you're going to make medicines, that's just the way. It's just the way of the world. But yeah, it's about how do you maybe be more elegant in your thinking and your discovery approaches than the companies that have come before you, and give yourself a higher likelihood of outpacing and being more agile and ultimately more productive than the larger organizations that you're moving in to compete with.
Okay, great. And I've got two more questions for you, and they both tie together. One on the greatest challenge or the thing that you would have changed or maybe acted on earlier in the journey of OperaBio that maybe would have helped accelerate. And two, then the advice you'd give to anyone else that was looking at starting up a biotech, and what would be most useful for them to know.
Well, let's say we start with the advice. I think it depends. I guess I give myself advice. Is that helpful? Because that's maybe the most useful context for me. I think the thing that I struggled with a lot over the first 3+ years of starting the company, or 3 years, let's say sub 3 years, was that I felt like I really wasn't qualified and didn't know enough about the industry to really succeed, or not succeed, to really be a big player, and felt, because it is heavily dominated by much more seasoned executives than myself. And I think that is actually a virtue. That not really coming from an entrenched viewpoint is actually an asset that enables you to think differently and really approach problems in a new way. And having increasingly spent time with very seasoned CEOs and executives from biopharma, I realize more and more how that is a really big asset to not come from sort of an entrenched view of the world, and to really have more confidence in your own abilities and your own sort of take on things. And that whole idea of first principles thinking, I know it's sort of a overused term now, but just being somewhat naive to the difficulties gives you an ability to really try and diagnose things from first principles and ultimately come up with new and potentially more effective ways of doing things. Now, that said, I would caveat with, you don't need first principles freaking everything. You don't need first principles org design, and there's reasons why some things are done a certain way, and just cut to the chase and copy, rinse and repeat. But there are more fundamental questions that I think that require you to think differently, and can be really beneficial to do so. That's the first question. The second question was around what you would have done differently.
Yeah, what would have accelerated the company as fast as possible if you known it now, looking back on the journey?
I think something we did well was go and get US capital as a UK European company. I think it's just faster capital. It's more ambitious capital. It's educationary capital. That's not a word. Educational capital, because they kick your ass. Like they're very clear on what they want. They know what good looks like, and they're not sort of fumbling through. I sometimes feel like others are. So I think that was a really good decision, and I would advise companies to do the same if starting out on this side of the world. And I guess for me, something I would have done differently sooner is healthy tension is natural and it's a good thing. And I think in science, there's always going to be a healthy tension because you're operating in the unknown. And I sometimes felt the need to sort of keep the peace. And I don't think that was actually useful. I think actually creating that healthy tension and allowing people to get comfortable and express themselves in that healthy tension is actually a way more productive way to run a company than otherwise. So anyway, that was just a personal lesson.
No, I think that's a really good lesson, and it's a hard, particularly maturity wise, right?
Yeah.
There's kind of typically the only way to realize that is through experience.
Yeah.
Picking up some scars and some grey hairs along the way, right?
Exactly. Yeah. You got to find ways to accelerate your grayingness. So find cheat codes. Let's just ask for advice, ask for lots of help. That's also a good strategy.
Yeah. That or a box of hair dye. One of
yeah, hair dye works too.
Good. Well, look, real pleasure to have you on the podcast. I think for anyone listening, there's loads of knowledge in there that they should take away, and a really exciting time ahead for the organisation. I think to your point, you say this year is going to be the year, right?
This is a big year. It's going to be a big year. I'm excited about this year.
Good. Well, thank you very much for joining me. Great to talk through the journey, and I'm hoping you'll come back on hopefully in 12 months' time and talk us through what's happened next.